far down. There we go. So what I wanted to speak about today in our second shir in our series on Tefillah is the question of Minyan. So I guess first, just as the general preface that I always begin with, while I share screen, I cannot see everybody. I can't see everyone on video. So if you want to talk, just feel free to unmute yourself and speak up for a question, for a comment, whatever it is. I'm not going to call on you because I can't really see everybody. I really encourage your participation. So feel free at any point just to either interrupt me or I'll prompt also. So speak up for a clarification, for an idea, a comment. Feel free. Part of that also, though, implies that everyone
question, has... Rabbi?
Yeah, Richard, right off the bat, go for it.
One question. Are your source sheets available somewhere in the Ethernet?
Yeah, they're all on Safaria, but I can share them before every share if you would like. Would that be helpful? Should I send it in the group chat?
I think so, because they're really very valuable. And, I start taking screenshots, and it's like kind of cumbersome. And so maybe there should be one central place in which, for all these talks, the source sheets are available.
I think that's a very, very good idea. We'll see what we can do in terms of the internet. I'll talk to Dana for the website and see if we can get a section on the website. But from now on, I'll just also, before every share, I'll just make sure to send my source sheets. So just one sec, actually. Let me then pull up a link to this source sheet. So that way it's easier if I stop sharing screen. That's great feedback, Richard. Thank you. See, everybody just speak up, and it works really well. This is what we're going to do during the share too. We're going to have a good give and take back and forth. But all right, 1 second. So I'll pull up the source, I'll share with everyone. Another just important background note. So first of all, yeah, everyone should be on mute until they're speaking, because otherwise background sounds get a little bit loud and confusing. But an important background is tonight I want to talk about Minyan, about the need for a quorum to pray, to daven. And before talking about Minyan, I think it's important to note and to get out there that Minyan is something that to some extent only appeals to half the population, because only men are counted towards the Minyan. And I just wanted to say that and note that while I'm talking about that, I recognize that. I also want to point out, though, that even though it's true that Minyan and counting towards the Minyan might be something that's only accessible to men within the Orthodox practice, it's not something that's only meaningful to men. And that both from a halakhic perspective and an experiential perspective, prayer of people of all gender identification, whatever it might be, also benefits and is also valuable or more valuable in a Minyan context without a Minyan. So while there is an important discussion to be had about the more painful elements of Minyan, who counts and why do they count, what I want to focus tonight is not on the question of who counts, or those perhaps more personally painful parts of Minyan, but rather just on the abstract, the idea of Minyan, of prayer in a communal context, which is surely relevant to all of us. So I guess that's just a necessary background. And now here, let me share this source sheet in the chat. So that should be my Safaria link. I believe it's public so that everyone can see. Just, Richard, do you want to try it out first before I start? Tell me if that's the case. And if need be, I'll go in and edit it, make sure it's public. Can we all, yeah, I'm pretty sure I just set this to public. There we go.
A nice thing, Rabbi, if you share your source sheet and anybody has a tablet or on their phone, they can download it to that without having to print it if they don't want to keep all the paper, and then follow along. Yeah,
that's a great idea for sure.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, Lindsay. Go ahead. I apologize for interrupting.
No, that's fine. That's what I wanted to share.
The source sheet went to my chat box, and I was able to open it up.
Awesome. Okay, great. So we have the source sheet available. It's in the chat. We've taken care of our background, and now we can begin to share with this question. The question that I think has been on my mind for a while, and beyond the general importance, I think during COVID is really important. I think to an extent, whenever I speak, I think am I speaking about COVID too much? But how can we not? Because that is our life right now. But this question of what is the importance of Minyan? Is Minyan even a mitzvah? So this idea of that communal prayer, that there's a need to daven with a quorum, to daven in this rigid communal structure, I don't know if we should be, it's so obvious that we should take this for granted, that this is a mitzvah, that it's a commandment, that it's an essential part of Jewish life. Because you see, when you look in the Shulchan Aruch, when you look in the codification of this mitzvah, the Shulchan Aruch has a very interesting formulation. The Shulchan Aruch says, in Orach Chaim, in the first source here, Yishtadel Adam Hispalo B'Veis HaKnesset Im HaTzibor. a person should try, ishtadel, to pray in a synagogue with the community, with the congregation. So right off the bat, what does the Shulchan Aruch not say? Everyone feel free to chime in. It's very clear he's not saying
that you must.
that you must. Exactly. He doesn't say chayav adam l'spal, you're obligated. He says it's a nice thing to do. You should try. So in fact, it's so obvious that the Shulchan Aruch omits saying that you must daven, that there's a chayav to daven b'tzibur, that all the commentaries more or less chime in and say, don't take him too literally. He doesn't mean just try. He really means that you must, which we can debate whether or not that's true. That might be more of a technical halachic question of how to interpret the Shulchan Aruch. But what's clear is the formulation chosen stands out. This isn't normally how we talk about halachic ideas. You should try to go in minyan. Should you try to shake lulav and etrog? No, it's a chiyuv.
Right.
So
you should try to keep kosher.
Exactly, yeah. Try.
Right? I mean, excuse me, you should
That'd be
try
possible.
to prune Ravu. What do you mean try? No, you need to give it all your all. Two very different Indians, but right?
Yeah, Richard, I don't think your second
Ooh.
example is a good one because some people try and it's not given to them to do it.
Okay, fine.
I agree.
But the point still remains the same. Richard's pointing out, this is like a very wild idea. You should try to do this mitzvah. So what does that even mean? Is it a mitzvah? How do we do something that you should try to do? So that's the background for which I want to discuss this. Now, and to that end, we start to see very early on in the halachic discussion of minyan, these sort of skeptical stances on minyan, these positions that don't take it necessarily as given that it's a mitzvah, maybe reflecting the Shulchan Aruch idea that you should try to have with the minyan. I guess there's just one more point to make in the Shulchan Aruch before we move on. Let me just get that little thing that I like so much, that little there, the red fuzzy thing, so everyone knows what I'm looking at. Just one more point to point out is that the Shulchan Aruch doesn't say, one, there's a mitzvah, two, there's a mitzvah to daven in shul. He says you should try to daven in a minyan, in shul, with the tzibur. So it's almost like he's describing various things that are all beneficial, but no one of them stands alone as a requirement. Just as much as it's daven in a synagogue than it is to daven somewhere random, it's better to daven with a tzibur, a better congregation, than it is to daven on my own. So this is just something to keep in mind in the background, that we have all these things sort of being grouped together. Fine. So, but what we see very early on in the development of halacha is that this idea of minyan, well, if we go early enough, this idea of minyan doesn't appear at all. Can anyone give me a pasuk or a biblical source that talks about minyan? I can't. There's no biblical sources that talk about the idea of a minyan, the idea of a quorum of men gathering together to pray. There is some sourcing for communal prayer, obviously. Maybe most obviously, we have Yericho, where there was communal prayer before the war with Jericho and the war to conquer Israel. There's a few moments of communal prayer or prayer-like ritual, but we don't really have this idea of a minyan anywhere in the Bible. And in fact, when we get to the Gemara sort of mentions it in passing. Never says it's a chiyuv, never says it's an obligation, never tells us that it's required. But in passing here and there, the Gemara will say, oh, well, those are things you can only do with a minyan. You can only say Kaddish with a minyan. You can only do these things with a minyan. But it doesn't tell us when do you need it? Why do you need the minyan? Is it a mitzvah? Is it an obligation? What's going on here? So early on in halacha, we start to see this confusion or ambiguity around minyan pop up. So the Maharil, Rabbi Yaakov ben Moshe Levi Molin, Maharil is really one of the most important codifiers of Ashkenazi tradition. Maharil lived in Germany in the 14th century, which was really towards the end of the German rabbinic reign. After many of the horrible pogroms, really the end of what was built there. And he codified the customs and traditions of all the various Germanic Jews and communities that lived there. And in fact, a lot of what we do in our practice, if you practice Ashkenaz, like I assume most of us do, is actually based on the Maharil. So the Maharil has an interesting comment in his work of halacha, and he's commenting on the idea of Eruv Chatzeros. So we know there's an idea of Eruv, of these artificial structures we build in Shabbat, and they allow us to imagine that our Reshut HaYachid, our private space, is larger than it really is. The most common Eruv we all talk about, and I'm sure we're all very familiar with because of the Lower East Side politics, is the Eruv for carrying. And that Eruv says that, really, everything is one giant house, everyone lives in one big house, so therefore you can carry. But there's also something called an Eruv Tchumen. The halacha is, it's machloket if it's a rabbinic law or a Torah law, but the halacha is you can't go more than a certain distance out away from your hometown on Shabbat. traveling too far is problematic. So there's an idea of an Erev Tchum that extends that boundary, that extends the distance that you can travel on Shabbat. But we're actually very reluctant to do that. And in a number of places, the Gemara expresses, well, technically you can do this thing, you should really resist doing it unless you have a really good reason to, such as a mitzvah. You really have to go to this mitzvah, someone's having a Shalom Zachar, they're having Sheva Brachos, something that you want to go to, and you can only get to there by going outside of your range in Shabbat. So that's a legitimate reason. Now, given that background, the Maharil is discussing this halacha, this idea of extending your tchum, extending how far you're able to go. And the Maharil says as follows: the parak Ketzah Mishtatfin in the Gemara and Erevin, in the chapter called Ketzah Mishtatfin, Tnan, it's taught in menichin erev tchumin rak lismoch alav leilech ledavar mitzvah. It's taught that you should only lay an erev tchumin, you should only expand your boundaries carrying of what? If you're going to do it for the sake of the mitzvah, could go in the Beit HaAvel and like pay a shiva call, the Beit HaMishteh, to go to Sheva Brachos or a wedding party. Amar Mahari Segal. So Mahari Segal, one of the contemporaries at the time, another one of the rabbinic authorities, Mahari Segal said, "The lo ra'a b'shum posek shemutter la'arev tchumin leilech lebeit hakneset kedei lahitpalal be'asara." The Mahari Segal says he's never heard anyone allowing an erev tchumin to enable you to go to Minyan. So we just said the Gemara in Erevin says you can only build an erev tchumin to do a mitzvah, and now comes Mahari Segal and says, and you know what? You can't do it for Minyan. The obvious implication being Minyan's not a mitzvah. Rak b'smak b'sefer aguda. There's some random early authorities, the Smak and the Aguda, they seem to say Minyan matters, but contemporarily, no poskim, no halachic authorities today in the times of the Maharil rule that way. Amar le harav Rabbeinu Ika, and this other authority of the time in Germany, Rav Ika responded, V'lo yehe pachom b'beit HaMishteh, and he said, are you going to tell me it's less of a mitzvah to daven with a minyan than it is to go to a wedding party? Amar le harav. So the Mahari said him, that's pala ba'asara, ena kol kach mitzvah. Yeah, I will say that. Davening with a minyan is not so much a mitzvah. So again, interesting formulation. He doesn't commit fully to saying it's not a mitzvah. Ena kol kach mitzvah. It's not so much so a mitzvah. It's not fully a mitzvah. Why? Because you can have kavanah and you can daven on your own without the minyan. So it can't be that necessary to daven with the minyan. Because nowhere in the Gemara, nowhere in the halachic literature do we find that the rabbis require you to daven. They might say it's a nice thing, it's a good idea, but you're never required. So if you're not required, can't be that much of a mitzvah. Aval Beit HaMishteh, but going and celebrating a wedding with a chasam and kala, mitzvahi, that's a mitzvah. So we see right off the bat, the Maharil establishes, perhaps shocking, I was very surprised to hear this, that not only is it not a chiyuv, not a requirement to daven with a minyan, but beyond that, it's not even necessarily a mitzvah to daven with a minyan. That if we say certain things, certain halachot only apply to mitzvah, they only apply to commandments, we might not be able to say that applies to a minyan. And therefore, when it comes to something like, are we willing to build an erev tchumin? Are we willing to employ our various halachic mechanisms to encourage certain behaviors? It might not be that important to encourage minyan. Now, as a side note, l'halacha, I think we rule that you can build an erev tchumin in order to go to a minyan. And we see in source Gimel, the Magen Avram very clearly disagrees with this Maharil. He says, "The Maharil nistapik mutar la'arev kedei leich leminyan." The Maharil is unsure of whether or not you can build an erev in order to go to minyan. V'fima shekata b'simin tzadi, and according to that, which we wrote earlier in the Shulchan Aruch, v'adai shari. Of course, it's mutar. Of course, it's permitted. The Magen Avram disagrees, and we end up holding like the Magen Avram. Now, the reason why, as a side note, the reason why this discussion actually has some practical relevance nowadays is because this question of to what extent must you put yourself out to attend a minyan is of course very relevant for Corona. Mm-hmm. Because when we have this question of risks and calculating risks of what is or isn't necessary, what is something that you should take a certain amount of risk on, obviously we all know there's a very basic idea of pikuach nefesh. Really like sustainably going to impact your chances of dying, God forbid, or severely injuring you. If you're a high risk person, whatever that might be, then there's not even a discussion. Obviously, halacha will tell you should be safe and you should stay home. But really, it's these gray areas where maybe it's not a concern of pikuach nefesh. I'm not going to die, but there's a whole host of reasons that should be disincentivized. Then we get into these questions of priorities. So we're not going to go into that halachic discussion. But I wanted to point out that this is one of the many sources that one could look at to sort of weigh that gray area, to weigh those priorities. How important is minyan? Well, is it important enough that we're willing to use some sort of halachic trick? We're willing to use an Erev? It's controversial. It's a machloket. But for our purposes, what I want to draw out of this is that when we're trying to examine the role and significance of a minyan, we have a machloket. We have a disagreement. On the one hand, the Maharil, writing in 14th century Germany, Maharil establishes that back then, nobody took minyan seriously enough to say that they'd be willing to build an Erev to go to minyan. Unheard of. He couldn't find a single posek. The Magen Avram, of a later authority who we happen to follow, disagrees. And he just says, Vadai, of course, it's obvious. Certainly a minyan is a mitzvah. So already we have this ambiguity in halacha. Is minyan a mitzvah or isn't a mitzvah?
Let me just ask a quick side question, and that is whether establishing an Erev Tom. Let's say I have my dear friend who happens to be outside of my Erev. But you know what? If I establish an Erev Tom, I can go visit with him. I can go have a meal with him. There's nothing usher about that, is there?
So it's a good point, right? So like Shabbos meals would presumably be more of a mitzvah, or enjoying Shabbos would be more of a mitzvah because it's okay. Shabbos. So once that's the case, then presumably, yeah, there'd be nothing wrong with it. I think it's an unresolved question that when the Gemara Eruvin says that you need something like a base avel or a base mishta, like a mourner or a wedding, is it saying you need something that is like specifically those?
So it has to be within tzorach mitzvah of some sort.
Exactly.
Okay. Thank you very much. I didn't realize that.
Yeah, and then the claim here, which is a huge claim, is that going to minyan isn't even tzorach mitzvah.
Right. Amazingly. Right.
All right. So shocking. So we see though that the Magen Avram disagrees, and perhaps one source, one backing for the Magen Avram comes from this Mishnah Megillah. The Mishnah Megillah tells us. Well, I guess his background. The Mishnah Megillah is discussing prayer, it's discussing Tefillah and just general liturgy and ritual. And there it's discussing the idea of a davar shebekdusha. Now we know certain parts of the ritual, certain parts of the liturgy require 10 men, a minyan, in order to recite them. So Kaddish is a famous example, reading from the Torah, Haftorah, all these things are requirements that require 10 men, require a quorum to do them. The Mishnah Megillah goes through all of them. In this list, in Perek Daled, where they list these divrei kedusha, Mishnah Gimel opens with a sort of confusing, ambiguous ritual idea. And it opens, and Mishnah Gimel says, Ein porson et Shema, ela be'asara, wherever that is. Right here at the end. Ein porson et Shema, we aren't pores the Shema, we don't cover the Shema, whatever that means. Pachos mesara, with less than 10. So it's actually subject to a really large debate with the rabbis and the Rishonim, what this means in portion of Shema. And this is it's a huge sugya, it's a huge topic in brachot, in the discussion in brachot about prayer. And it happens to be that the majority approach, if I remember my brachot correctly, which I can't guarantee, but at least one approach, I think it's the majority approach, is that in portion at Shema is actually referring to a ritual that's a little bit less resonant nowadays. But apparently in the times of the Gemara, and maybe even to the Rishonim, just like we have communal Shmona Esrei, we have Chazarat Hashatz, where we all say Shmona Esrei out loud together. Back then, they also assumed people can say Shema. So they had some kind of public ritual. The Chazan would be pores, he would cover his eyes in Shema, and he would lead everybody together in a communal Shema ritual. Something to that effect. That seems to be what Pores HaShema is about. And since that ritual fell out of practice, whereas Chazarat Hashatz, the repetition of Shmona Esrei, didn't fall out of practice, we understand very well and easily all the parts of the Gemara that talk about Chazarat Hashatz, and we're very confused by the parts that talk about Pores HaShema. That's the simple approach that many Rishonim take. But the Korban Netanel, Rav Nathan Weil in the 18th century Germany, perhaps more famous for his work describing the Yerushalmi, but also a commentator on the Bavli. Rav Nathan Weil has a very interesting approach. And Rav Nathan Weil says here, Ein porson hashma pachos mesara, quotes this Mishnah that you can't say be pores hashma, that you can't say Shema less than 10. Mekan shuva lama shekatav maharil behilchot erev chatzeros. This source is a response, is a good response, is a tshuva, an answer to that which the Maharil writes in the Salachot of Erev Chatzeros, she'ein ma'arvin lavo lehispala ba'asara, that we don't make an Erev to go down with 10. Because there's no source in the rabbis that say you need to daven with a minyan. This Mishnah is a source. It's a proof that it's a chovat tzibor. It's a requirement on the community, on the public to have a minyan. In other words, the Korban Netanel interprets this ambiguous phrase of being poreis al Shema, all covering up for the Shema, as talking about a minyan, davening overall, saying Shema and Shmona Esrei together with a minyan. And says the Korban Netanel, here we have a raya, here we have a source in the Mishnah itself that you have to daven with a minyan with 10. And just like all these other Dvarim Shebekdusha, these holy matters are learned out from the requirement of V'nichdashti b'toch b'nei Yisrael, that God commands the Jewish people to sanctify his name amongst the Jewish people and amongst the world. So too, presumably minyan would fall into that category. It's a davar shebekdusha, it's a mitzvah just as much as everything else is a mitzvah, and this is the source for it in the rabbinic literature. That's the claim of Korban Netanel. Now, obviously, this is a very weak sourcing. If the only source you have for an idea is an innovative interpretation that the majority of other people don't interpret, it's not the best sourcing. But nonetheless, we see that it's not obvious that the Maharil's position is taken as dogma. First of all, when it comes to the halacha itself, the Magen Avraham completely disagrees. He says, no, we do in fact build that Eruv. And explicitly, when it comes to the mitzvah status, the question at the heart of this halachic question, the Korban Netanel himself also disagrees. Korban Netanel says, no, obviously it's a mitzvah, and this is much more in line with what we intuitively believe. So what we've seen so far is that we have a machloket about the status of davening with a minyan in halacha. Is it a mitzvah or is it not a mitzvah? Maybe a nice idea, something you should strive for. But not a mitzvah. Yeah, please, Lindy.
No, I was reading. I apologize.
Oh, no problem. So we have this machloket, we have this dispute as to whether or not the need to daven with a koran, the need to daven with a minyan is a mitzvah. On the one hand, the Maharil says it's not a mitzvah, and therefore we're not willing to build an Eruv to accommodate people going to minyan. On the other hand, we see that the Magen Avraham and the Korban Netanel say, no, it is a mitzvah, we will build that Eruv, and it's part of the mitzvah of davar shebekdusha, of holy matters that need a quorum, etc., etc. That's where we are at right now. Now, all that really buries the question, which is, who cares if it's a mitzvah? What does it matter if it's a mitzvah? Is it important if something's a mitzvah? I do tons of things all the time that are not mitzvot. I'll give you a great example. I can guarantee you kaparot are not a mitzvah. There's nowhere that we're commanded to do kaparot. We do it, and it's a ritual that's meaningful to some, depending on your thoughts and views. But we have all these different types of tradition and rituals that are not mitzvot, but they're still meaningful, they're still legitimate. So who cares whether or not it's a mitzvah? So again, this goes back to what we were saying before about the question of priorities. The formal status minyan has as a mitzvah, as a command, as something expected of us, versus a davar reshut, something that we're allowed to do, something that maybe is good for us to do. That really concretely expresses itself when you have competing priorities. Competition for prioritizing time, for prioritizing space and ability. How exactly do you treat minyan in that context? So to that end, we see this expressed in the modern poskim, in the contemporary decision makers. So if we look in source number 6 here, in the Shut Yisa Ish, I guess to expose everybody to a little bit of more out there, perhaps less known by us Ashkenazi, perhaps even Hasidic background Jews that stand in. The Yisa Ish is Rav Yaakov Shal El Yashar. He was a rabbi in Syria, Ottoman-controlled Syria. And in the 19th century, he was a major Sephardic authority. And he's quoted in law by Rav Ovadia Yosef, in fact. But so this Rav Yaakov Shaul El Yashar, the Yisa Ish, got a question from in the 19th century. And Nisham in New York, question from New York, Odot Chevra, regarding community, Sheyista Beit HaKnesset, they founded a shul, Veitkinu Sheitpala Shama Pi Nusach HaGra K'minhag Ashkenaz. And when they founded the shul, everybody agreed, we're going to use Nusach Ashkenaz, we're going to daven according to the minhag of the Gra, the Vilna Gaon. Good. Va'ata, now, Natosvu Yechidei HaChevra, Nohagim Natpala K'minhag Mizkar. Now they've gained new members, and those new members don't daven Nusach HaGra. They grew up davening Nusach Edot HaMizrach. They daven some other Nusach. And they're concerned that if they daven Nusach HaGra, they who grew up davening a different Nusach, a different text, are not actually fulfilling their mitzvah, because they're diverging from the practice that their forefathers practiced. They're diverging from their custom, and they're adopting a different minhag. Is there anything to their concern? Ubeprat, and specifically, שבטרם ייכנסו לחברה הנראה לעיל, קיימו וקיבלו עליהם כל תקנות החברה. And specifically, you should know that before they agreed to enter our community, they had already agreed to accept all of our communal takanot, all of our communal decrees. So we have this group of people, this group of Sfardim from the Eidot HaMizrach who move into our community, and they're saying they need to dominate Eidot HaMizrach or they won't be able to fulfill their chiyuv, fulfill their obligation. But before they moved in, they promised us they were going to listen and be a part of our community. So are they right? Is there a problem with them changing their nusach? Are they wrong? What should we do? That was the question posed to Rabbi Yaakov Shal Yashar. So Rabbi Yaakov Shal Yashar answers, Yisa Ish answers, and he says, in my opinion, it's obvious that they cannot change the original custom that they received from their forefathers. They should daven, if the community davens Nusach Gra, but they grew up davening Nusach Sfarad, maybe not Sfarad, but Nusach Eidot HaMizrach, they daven the Sfardi Nusach, then of course they should daven the Nusach, they should say and pray with the text that they grew up saying. Ella, however, if there isn't a minion's worth of individuals who daven with that text, with that nusach, and they want to go off and daven on their own individually, we do not give them permission to do that. We force them to daven with the minyan, even if davening with the minyan will mean they must diverge from the custom they grew up with. So says the Yisa Ish, says Rav Elyashar, when we have the priority question of nusach, of this idea of minhag avatehem, of traditional continuity, of continuing your customs on the one corner, versus the value of minyan in the other corner, minyan wins. Goes without saying that even if you have to compromise your nusach, compromise your tradition, go against the value of Masorah, of individual tradition, nonetheless, that's something that's a pill you have to swallow in order to continue to daven with a minyan. That's the psak of Yisa Ish. Now, given what we've just discussed, according to what approach, what perspective of minyan, would it make more sense to say that minyan is a priority, minyan wins out against the idea of minhag, minyan wins out in this case, and therefore you must daven with a minyan. Anybody feel free to chime in here? Who does this make more sense? Who is this similar to? Not everybody at once. This is similar to the approach put forth by the Magen Avraham and the Korban Netanel, that minyan's a mitzvah. If minyan's a mitzvah, if minyan's a requirement, then of course minyan can supersede certain other things, certain other requirements. There's a mitzvah or an inyan, there's some sort of halachic value to the idea of tradition, of Masorah, of maintaining tradition. But there's also a mitzvah, there's also real significant weight to davening with a minyan. So therefore, when we're forced to choose between these two, we decided that it's more important to daven with a minyan. That would be the position put forth by the Yisa Ish, Rav Elyashar. However, we see the exact opposite idea also expressed in halacha, that some halachic authorities adopt the opposite stance. So if you look in the Sefer Nefesh David, it was written by the Aderet. Has anyone ever heard of the Aderet before?
No.
The Aderet was a 19th century Lithuanian rabbi, and Aderet stood for Rav Eliyahu David Rabinovitz Ta'omim. Ta'omim being the Hebrew word for twins, because he was a twin. I don't know the history of how that got amended to his name. I don't know if he took it on himself, if someone added it to him. Sort of interesting. But the Aderet wrote this book, the Nefesh David, which have a bunch of his different thoughts on halacha and liturgy. And in the Nefesh David, he says, in that section, he's discussing whether or not you can have impromptu minyanim, house minyanim, shtiva minyanim, etc. And he says, Matam zeladati. Okay, actually, let me zoom out so we can see the Hebrew and English. So someone wants to follow in English. There we go. Very good. So he says, Matam zeladati in chashash leilech leitpalel beit midrash. Because of the above analysis, we're not going into. He thinks it's fine to have a minyan in the beit midrash, or asof minyan b'bayit, or to have a minyan in the house. Kiman shekain hanug b'kol hashana. Because this is how, in the case he's discussing, they've always done it. And if someone wants to go and daven in a sukkah, of course he should go daven in the sukkah and fulfill the Torah mitzvah of being in the sukkah. And it's even better he go and daven the yechida, daven on his own in a sukkah, daven with a minyan in a shul or in a beit midrash. Why? Shehu rak snifla mitzvah, because minyan is just a snifla mitzvah. It's a branch off of the mitzvah of prayer. It's not itself a mitzvah; it's a branch. Ve'elu min Torah. It's not from the Torah. It's nowhere in the Bible. And if you want to say, well, minyan is at least a public good, it's something that the community does together, like we see in brachot. That doesn't make it any more important, or doesn't make sukkah any less important than this public good of minyan. So of course, the mitzvah d'oraita, the Torah mitzvah sukkah, should win out. And he references a Rambam, which is not very clear that's what the Rambam means, so we'll leave out this question proof. But he concludes, and I personally, whenever I go to the Beit Midrash, I have this desire to pray where I'm learning. And sukkah is a mitzvah that's even more beloved to me than going to the Beit Midrash. And it's only because I don't want people to degrade the value of public prayer, which I see already that people are very makel and lenient about. Therefore, I don't do it. But theoretically, on a halachic level, it'd be totally fine for me to abandon minyan to follow my preferences. If I want to daven in a Beit Midrash because I daven better there, that's fine. And certainly, if I want to daven in a sukkah, where there's a mitzvah d'oraita, there's a Torah mitzvah every second I'm standing in the sukkah, for sure we'd prioritize a real mitzvah over minyan, which, like he says, is rak snif the mitzvah. It's just a branch off of the mitzvah. So we see that this machloket between the Maharil on the one side and the Magen Avram and the Korban Tana on the other, as to whether or not it's a mitzvah to daven with the minyan, or merely a good idea, merely good advice, that is practically expressed in these different perspectives on how to prioritize minyan. On the one hand, we had the Yisa Ish we saw before, Rav Yasher, who said that minyan is so important that it's better you daven with a minyan and you don't daven with your nasach than daven alone with your nasach without a minyan. But on the other hand, we see here the Aderet expressing that really minyan is not necessary at all. And if you would prefer, you think you'll daven better in another context, api halacha, that's totally fine. Daven wherever you want. Yeah, there's some policy concerns, there's communal issues. If you're not going to help the minyan, that might be bad for the community. And that's a valuable concern that he's worried about. But from the halachic standpoint, it's not a mitzvah to daven with a minyan. So far, so good. Does that make sense to everybody? Anyone have any questions at this point?
This is the obvious kind of confrontation between the individual and the communal. And what's so interesting, of course, is that, of course, our, God bless them, our have dealt with this and recognized this. And as in typical Jewish form, have not really come down on one side or the other, as well they shouldn't. You know, I mean, there are certain times in our lives in which our individual needs are more important. And so, you know what? I gotta concentrate better. And the minyan's not really working for me. And there are other times where, hey, if it worked for the minyan and my communal life, where would I be? So this is a classic confrontation of these two Indians.
Beautifully said. I think communal prayer is the battleground where so much of this takes place, that conflict between the community and the individual. And I hope as we go on in the shir, that will be one of the final points that we develop to, of that balance there. But I think it's a beautiful point. Now we see minyan is really framed as in the context of this tension. Was someone else speaking?
Can I ask a question?
Go for it.
Why is a minyan 10, not 8, not 12, or any other number?
So I left out the background information that just establishes the basis of a minyan, but the very background basis of a minyan is fascinating. The Gemara learns it out from the word Eidah, that we're supposed to sanctify God in Toch HaEdah, amongst the nation, the congregation. And that same word Eidah also appears by the Meraglim, by the spies who sinned when they reported negatively about the land of Israel. And we know there were 12 spies, one for each tribe, minus Yehoshua and Caleb, who didn't say Lashon Hara about Israel, who didn't speak badly and slander Israel. So there are 10 spies who slandered Israel, and they're referred to as an Eidah. And the Jewish people, when they're commanded to sanctify God, are also referred to as an Eidah. So it must be that it's 10 is the basis for an Eidah. So I think it's very, very interesting and telling that the basis for a minyan is a group that gets together to slander and talk Lashon Hara together. There's a lot to say about that. I think it's a beautiful kiyum of what we're able to all fulfill every time we go to shul. But yeah, it's definitely, it's like a fascinating idea. Also, we know that the other time Eidah appears, and this also is learned in the Gemara, is in the context of Korach, another bad guy who goes and assembles a bunch of people to sin together. So it's very interesting. Thank you for raising the question and pointing it out. That really what we see is that this idea of the Eidar, the community, it has extreme power for bad, for negativity, for Lashon Hara and these negative echo chambers. But Chazal are honing in on that power and trying to turn it for good. So I think that's very powerful and very moving. But what I do think, did I answer the question? Was that sufficient? Okay, I hope so. But what I do think this also really points out, though, is the question of what is Minyan accomplishing? I think this is just inherent. This is the question that's being begged by our analysis so far. If Minyan is not a mitzvah, there's no commandment to daven with a Minyan, then why do we daven with a Minyan at all? What are we accomplishing by davening with a Minyan? By praying with a quorum, praying together? So I think to that end, we have to look at this fascinating piece I found by the Mabit, by Rav Moshe ben Yosef the Tarani, 16th century rabbi in Tzfat. He writes in his Beit Elokim, which is a theological work that we referenced in the Kol Nidre Drasha earlier this year. So if you missed it, feel free to look that up too. But in the Beit Elokim, the Mabit discusses various theological ideas, talks a lot about prayer, and in that context, he gives us a fascinating historical perspective on Minyan. Says the Mabit in source 8 here. Ki mizman Moshe Rabbeinu alav hashalom ad Knesset Hagdola, from the times of Moshe until the Great Assembly, the collection of Jewish leaders with prophets amongst them who canonized the Bible and really solidified what became the rabbinic tradition. Haita hashchina niglet b'makom hakorban. God's presence, the Shechina, was niglet. It was revealed. It was present in the spot of sacrifices in the Temple Mount. Haita nevuah adayin b'Yisrael, and prophecy was still in Israel. Haita nishmet tefillah kol yachid b'yachid u'berchaso le'el yisparach anasom olam. And every individual's prayer and every individual's blessings were immediately heard by God. Says the Mabit that in the times of the temple, man was much closer to God because we had a house for God and God occupied that house. So since we had this closer physical manifestation from God, it was easier to have your prayer be heard. No matter where you prayed in the world, God would hear you. And to me, this appears to be the reason why nobody gathered together with a minyan to daven Shachris Mincha or Maariv, and designated it as a time to daven as a community. Every individual would pray on their own. Because nowhere in the Bible, nowhere in the tradition do we see mention of this idea of a minyan until after the period of the destruction of the temple. Then the men of the Great Assembly established we should say Shemona Esrei, V'dvarim Shebekdusha, and holy matters, She'enam V'pachal Mi'asara. And those require 10 people. So part 1 says the Mabit, why is it that there's no mention of a minyan in the Torah, no mention in Nevi'im, nowhere in the Bible? Why is minyan so sparsely sourced? Because it didn't exist. Minyan's a new invention, says the Mabit. Back in the day, God's presence was revealed in the temple. We were all very physically close to God, whatever the metaphysics of that imply. And therefore, prayer was easier. Nowadays, prayer is much harder. And therefore, in order to accommodate for that, we have to gather together in a group of 10. Why? Because the Gemara in Brachos tells us whenever 10 Jews gather together, 10 men gather, Jewish men gather together, God goes and meets them there. God sends his presence down to see what's up. Why are the Jews congregating? So if we want to recreate a facsimile of what we accomplished in the temple, where we are able to pray to God face to face, we are able to have God's presence be a tangible part of our prayer experience. We need to artificially bring God's presence down. And the way we're able to artificially do that is by having a minyan. So in other words, says the Mabit, the role of minyan is entirely functional. Back in the day, you would have a great prayer and your prayer would be more likely to be listened, even if you didn't daven with a minyan. Nowadays, functionally, your prayer is more likely to be accepted if you daven with a minyan. So in order to increase the functionality of our prayer, to increase our chances of God listening to us, you should daven with a minyan. That's the idea of the Mabit. The entire idea of minyan is predicated on the concept of bringing God's Shechina, bringing the divine presence down. And then once that's the case, minyan must be serving a functional role in helping our prayers. And in fact, perhaps one could point out a basis for the Maharit in the Rush. The Rush is actually discussing a case, a halacha, that was unfortunately very relevant to us not so long ago. The Rush is discussing a case where you can't get a minyan, but can you count 9 people and a child? It's a machlok in the Gemara. Can you count 9 people and a child for a minyan? Can you count 9 people in a Sefer Torah for a minyan? And that discussion is actually very much based in the same Gemara about what brings down the Shechina. 10 people in a Beit Midrash brings down the Shekhinah. 9 people and a child brings down the Shekhinah. 9 people in a Sefer Torah brings down the Shekhinah, etc., etc. So in that context, says the Rush, the Chen Pirish Rav Hai Gaon, the Katan Ola Minyan Asara. Rav Hai Gaon says that you can have a minor, a child, be the 10th person for a minyan. The year Dahainu Taima Darmina Defilim Mutaba Mitzaref. And that's why there's an opinion in the Gemara that says even an infant can count for a minyan. The Chol Be'asara Shechina Shruya. Because any 10 individuals, the Shechina, the divine presence reveals it. Because we learn it from the commandment to sanctify God amongst the Jewish people. And whether or not you're an adult male, you count as one of the Jewish people. It happens to be that this position of the Rush is obviously problematic because he still doesn't really think women count for a minyan, or that avadim, slaves of various statuses, count for a minyan. And he goes on to try and explain, well, there's a difference between somebody who will one day eventually be commanded in a mitzvah and someone who's never totally removed from the commandment. And even this child, this male child, will one day become an adult who's commanded. But without going into the details of how exactly he deals with this halachic question of whether to count a child, what we see very clearly,
Just for 2 seconds.
what we see very clearly, just a reminder to everybody to mute if speaking. But what we see very clearly from the Rush is that the reason for a minyan, and this is halachic, the reason for a minyan for the Rush is because we need to bring down the Shekhinah. And that causes the Rush to reach a halachic conclusion. If we only can get to 10 with a child, well, if the function of minyan is bringing the Shekhinah, and the Shekhinah will come even with a child, surely a child should count for a minyan too. So the Rush seems to be picking up this idea of Mabit, that really it's fully functional. The point of a minyan is to serve the function of enhancing our prayers' acceptability in front of God by bringing God closer and thereby facilitating a more effective prayer. Therefore, if we have 9, count the child, that'll bring the Shekhinah down too. So what we have here is a functional theory of minyan, that minyan is to make prayer better. That's what minyan is.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, please.
If a child will complete a minyan, why won't a woman complete the minyan?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that's one of the biggest weaknesses with the Rush. The Rush goes on to try and answer that question. I alluded to this earlier, but I guess to spell it out. He says that, well, the Shekhinah will rest with anybody who is 1, a person, and 2, it will eventually be chayav in all of mitzvot. Women are people, but they'll never be chayav in all of mitzvot because they're exempt from other mitzvot. I don't know where he gets that from. He just asserts it as obviously true. I don't know. But yeah, that's by far the biggest weakness of this position of the Rush. Why shouldn't women and avadim and other categories of people and statuses and halacha also count? It's a great
A woman has a soul as well.
Yeah. It's a great point. So yeah, so I can't resolve that halacha question in terms of how minyan works. I think it's a really strong one. But what we do see is more broadly, if we want to sacrifice these metaphysics, if we want to forgo the idea of what brings down the Shekhinah, the most minimal claim we can make is that minyan is serving a functional role for prayer. Like we saw before, it's a snif mitzvah of Tefillah. It's a branch, it's in a subcategory of Tefillah, that there's a mitzvah, there's a commandment to pray. What's the best way to pray? What sets you up for success? Pray with a minyan. That's what we see from the Rush. That's what comes out forward from this position brought forward in the Mabit and the Beit Elokim. The history of it's fascinating because it's predicated on this idea that there was no minyanim during the times of the temple because there was no need for it. But so we see that in this question of is a mitzvah, is there a commandment, is there a requirement to pray with a minyan? The Mabit comes out and says, no, it's not a mitzvah. Obviously it's not a mitzvah because back in the day, they didn't even have minyanim. Rather, minyan is an aid. It's a crutch. It allows us to be able to achieve the same heights that our forefathers were able to achieve without minyan. So the metaphysics of that don't personally speak to me, but I think perhaps something that maybe does speak to me a little more, and a more similar idea, that minyan is serving some sort of functional role, can be viewed through perhaps a less halachic and a more experiential, a more Hasidic lens. That we see, for example, in source number 10, just a translation of one of Rav Nachman of Breslav's Sichot. He says, the Rebbe also said that it may be impossible to go through the entire service with proper devotion, with kavana. Still, each person can say a small portion with true feeling. We see this all the time. One person might have deep feelings while saying the Ketoret, and another might pray best during the Psuki de Zimra. In other words, says Rav Nachman that a minyan, and this is a comparison that you find often in Hasidic and even more contemporary sources, a minyan's like an orchestra. I don't know if we have anybody who's a composer here on the call. I know some of our members are composers, but a minyan's like an orchestra. They have different strengths, different abilities. So one individual won't be able to best pray on their own, But if everybody gangs up together and brings their strength, pools their strength, that'll be an amazing prayer because we'll be able to hit the strengths of everybody else. But again, what we see is it's not that the minyan is a chiyuv, it's not an obligation. The minyan does not have any independent value. It's merely a way to enhance prayer. Prayer is better with a minyan. Why? Because if you have a bad voice, then someone with a good voice can sing. And when they sing, overall, the prayer experience will be more beautiful. Or if you don't have korbanot and sacrifices and the Ketorah really takes you out of it, somebody who's really into it can inspire you and can cover for you and make the prayer more beautiful. So it's a metaphysical interpretation on this idea of bringing down the Shekhinah, but it's very clearly operating in the same world. Minyan is not a requirement, but an enhancement. It makes prayer better. And that's why Yishtadel Adam, like the Shulchan Aruch says, it's a person should try, should make an effort. It's a good thing to pray with a minyan. It's not a chiyuv. It's not an obligation. So that's the first position put forth by the Mabit, perhaps expressed
If I may,
please.
I heard a variant of that, which I always liked actually, that it's not so much more beautiful prayer, but a more perfect prayer, that you may pronounce a word wrong, or you may stumble over a word, but that word somebody else got. And so through the entire congregation. And in the end, what comes up to Shamayim is one perfect prayer. And that counts for everybody who was in the room.
I think that's a beautiful idea too. It's a beautiful idea. It's very powerful, but also it highlights the idea that theoretically, if you were a perfect prayer, you would have no reason to ever go to a minyan, right? Minyan isn't inherently valuable. It's functionally valuable because of what it provides us. So I think, thank you. I'll share that next time I learn this too, because that's a beautiful formulation of it. But I think on the opposite end here, we have Rav Ovadia Yosef and some of the other contemporary authorities. They push back against this loose-handed position on minyan. Oh, it's not a mitzvah, it's just an idea, it's nice. And more specifically, Rav Ovadia actually responds directly, and he challenges his historical claim. He says it's not true that they didn't have minyan in the times of the temple. Why do you think that's true? So if you look in the Yabia Omer and Rav Ovadia's tshuva here, he says, "Ayin lahamabit v'sefer Beit Elohim," and look at the Mabit in his book Beit Elohim. L'chorek kashem mashakatam b'brachot. It seems difficult, his position, that minyan didn't exist in the time of the temple, based on what we see in brachot. Gamar Rabbi Yochanan Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, that the Gemara brachot quotes Rabbi Yochanan quoting Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. My dichtiv, what is the Torah? What is the Tehillim? What does the pasuk mean? The verse mean when it says, "Va'ani tefillati lecha Hashem et ratzon," and I, my prayer is to you, Hashem, in the time of desire. What's it mean that my prayer should be in a time of desire, in et ratzon? Et ratzon, when is this moment of desire? B'shah she'tzibur mitzpalan, the moment when the congregation is praying. Adkan. So it quotes a pasuk from Tehillim, it quotes a verse from Psalms, and from there it learns that the best time to pray is with a minyan. How come on? This is earlier. The Darish Mikra de David, the B'shah she'tzibur mitzpalan havi et ratzon. This is learning from a verse written by David, because the assumption of the Gemara and of the tradition is that all of Psalms were written by David. It's a questionable assumption. Happens as a side note, Psalm 72 concludes with "Here ends the book of Psalms of David." So it's a little bit questionable. What about the other 78 Psalms? If in the middle of 72 we say David's done writing them. So it seems like even Tehillim itself recognizes there's multiple authors. But nonetheless, Chazal uniformly assume, the tradition assumes, David wrote all of the Psalms. And if that's the case, if the Psalm teaches us that the best way to pray is with the minyan, surely in the times of David, which even predates the temple, there must have been a concept of minyan. That's the assumption that Rav Ovadia makes. We can point out, one, the questionable status of the authorship of Tehillim, but also two, we can also point out that's not necessarily how drushot, how halachic learning works, how exposition works in the Bible. It's not necessarily true that just because we learn an idea from Tehillim, that means that David, who wrote Tehillim, was living that very idea. There's tons of instances where that's not true in the Gemara, but nonetheless, Rav Ovadia assumes that. So Rav Ovadia says, we see very clearly that David had a minyan, or else he wouldn't be telling us, you should daven with a minyan. V'chein Rav Acha Darish Hatam, and Rav Acha also learns there, Mikra de Yeshayahu, from a verse about Isaiah. So clearly Isaiah also had a minyan, if we're learning from Isaiah, mitzvot about minyan. Alma Shagam Az Hayun Isram L'Kal Beit Knesset. It must be that in those times they were also gathering together to pray with a minyan and shul. And it's a stretch to say that all of these verses are just an asmachta, are just literary references, but not historical or halachic sources. Sometimes we find throughout the Gemara, the rabbis do what's called a smachta. They have an idea that they're familiar with. They have a halacha or a ritual practice that's already pervasive. And as part of the oral Torah, as part of the mission of creating a canonized, easily to remember, easily packaged Torah, they try to pin those rabbinic or Torah Shabbal Peh, oral ideas or contemporary practices, they try to pin them on a verse. It helps with memory, it helps you remember them, it helps give some sort of structure to the entirety of halacha. That's called an asmachta. It's not learned from the Torah, it's not learned from the verse. The verse is actually more or less irrelevant. It's just like a mnemonic to remember it. It says Rav Avadia, if we have this whole machloket, we have all these different sources as to how we learn minyan's important, you're going to dismiss all of those as an asmachta. As a side note, methodologically, I would argue that that is exactly what one should do. That if we have something as pervasive as minyan, and we have no clear answer where it comes from, how we know that it's better to daven with a minyan, it's likely because it's a more recent practice, and any verse we try to pin it on is in fact just an asmachta. And perhaps this is even strengthened by the fact that all the verses quoted in this Gemara are from Nevi'im and Ketuvim, from prophets and writings, whereas we know halachot are learned from the Torah, from the 5 books of Moses, and are not learned from later writings. So the logic of Rav Avadia is a little questionable here, but nonetheless, he says we see from the Gemara, it must be that in the times of the temple, they did in fact have a minyan. And he goes further, he quotes another source, V'ayim b'Yushalmi. Look at the Yushalmi and Brachot, the Jerusalem Talmud, the Muchach Shagam b'Vayis Rishon hayu olam espalin v'Samikdash. And there it proves that in times of Bayit Rishon, in times of the first temple, people would go up to the temple and pray there with a minyan. So he told us, Rav Avadia tells us to look at the Yerushalmi. So we'll look at the Yerushalmi. So Yerushalmi, at the end of Parak Daled, Halacha Daled, chapter 4, Halacha 4 in Brachot, it tells us, Sarich Adam Lahaseh Panav L'Kotel L'Palo. A person has to face the wall when he prays. So Halacha, the Gemara learns, Ma'atam, what's the reason? It quotes a pasuk from Isaiah, V'yisav Chezkehu Panav L'Kir. And Chezkehu turned his face towards the wall. So now Chazal, the rabbis pick up on this interesting formulation. It says El Hakir, that Chezkehu turned his face towards the wall, capital T, capital W. And they try to say, what wall? What's the wall? So they go on and on their Doresh, they expound. Rabbi Chanina bar Papa Amar, Rabbi Chanina bar Papa says, Bekirut Beit HaMikdash, Nasa Einav. He raised his eyes and envisioned the walls of the temple. He raised his eyes to the walls of the temple. And now it quotes a pasuk from Yecheskel, a pasuk from Ezekiel, Betatam sapam et zipi, muzuzotam esa muzuzatai, ve'akir b'nei b'nehem. God says to Yecheskel, in their setting of their threshold, by my threshold, and their doorpost besides my doorpost, and there was but the wall between me and them. So as necessary background, God is criticizing the Jewish people, as is one of God's greatest hits. God is saying an unfortunately too true statement. They care so much about ritual, they care so much about minyan, they care so much about kashrut, and they don't care about interpersonal halachot at all. They steal from each other, they rob each other, they violate the law. Why do I need their prayer? So within that general theme, God says people are so dedicated to prayer that they literally build their houses as close as possible to the Beit HaMikdash. It's as if their door is touching my door, God's door. It's as if their walls are attached to my walls. It's as if they built their house literally as part of the Beit HaMikdash because they're so eager to pray in the Beit HaMikdash. So says the Gemara, B'nei Adam Gedolah. So just before I can get to the Gemara, it's an interesting note that what's about to happen is that this pasuk in Yecheskel is God criticizing the Jewish people. Ezekiel is expressing God's disappointment that we care more about ritual than about interpersonal commitments. But the Gemara is going to get rid of all the context and say, look at this nice thing God assumes about the Jewish people. He thinks the Jewish people are so committed to prayer. Isn't that great? So that's like a funny thing that we find sometimes, that within the tradition, we'll take psukim out of context that are clearly meant to be critical, and they'll end up being about praise. Sometimes we do that in songs, like the song Chazak, Chazak, Chazak. So that song in the middle, the verse, I don't know it all by heart, but it borrows like a phrase, a pasuk about like gathering together. But that pasuk about gathering together is about gathering together to worship Avodah Zarah and rejecting God. But we take it out of context, so we cut out the parts about Avodah Zarah, and now it means something else altogether, and it's a beautiful song. We all really love it. So in a similar sense, we see that Chazal go and they darshan this pasuk from Yecheskel to be a praise of the Jewish people, and it's clear in context, it's a criticism. But fine, so we have this pasuk where God says the Jewish people are building their houses so close to my house. Good, so from there the Gemara learns, B'nei Adam Gedolim Hayu, the very important people lived in Jerusalem, the diplomats and the religious leaders. And they weren't always free to go and pray in the Beit HaMikdash. So they would make sure that their houses were close to the Beit HaMikdash. And then whenever they got a free moment to stop from work, they would stop and they would pray. And because they did this and they made that effort to be as close to the Beit HaMikdash as possible, God considers it as if they were actually physically praying in the Beit HaMikdash itself. So says the Gemara, there's a pasuk where God says, the Jewish people are right on top of me, they're very close to me. The Gemara says, people wanted to go pray in the Beit HaMikdash, but they weren't able to, so they got as close to the Beit HaMikdash as they could. So what we see is, there was some sort of preconceived idea that you should go pray in the Beit HaMikdash, that everyone should gather together and pray in the Beit HaMikdash. It seems like this is some sort of model of communal prayer that took place in the time of the Beit HaMikdash. As a side note, it's really not so hard to say this is not a model of what we consider minyan at all today. We know from multiple sources that there was prayer that accompanied the sacrifice in the Beit HaMikdash. That's like well documented. That doesn't mean it was a minyan. Perhaps people were more inspired by the Beit HaMikdash. Perhaps going back to like the Mabit, that's where the Shekhinah was the most clear. So that's where everybody wanted to physically be. Even if the Shekhinah could be reached anywhere, maybe you wanted to go to the Beit HaMikdash because that's where it's the closest. This is hardly a slam dunk proof against the Mabit. But nonetheless, we do see it gets taken as evidence, as proof, that back in the time of the temple, there was minyan on the Temple Mount, if not everywhere. So we see a minimal rejection of Mabit. It's not true that in the times of the temple there's no minyan, because minimally, based on this Yerushalmi, we can claim there was minyan in the temple. And in fact, the Ali Tamar, Rabbi Sachar ben Svitar, one of my favorite is on the Yerushalmi, one of my favorite books in general. At my wedding, at my chassan tish, my speech was based off of an Ali Tamar. I really loved Ali Tamar. It just happens to be that there's certain books that people will be like, oh, like, well, if you went to Gush, then obviously if you went to Gush to learn, obviously you know the Ali Tamar and the Emek HaBracha and just these random like achronisha books that talk about like lamdish conceptual thought. So the Ali Tamar is one of those. It investigates the Yerushalmi, which is a work that really we don't write so much about because it's very difficult and very disorganized. And he has these just amazing ideas in the Yerushalmi. But the Ali Tamar, Rabbi Sachar ben Tamar, he comments on this Yerushalmi about this idea of the Anashim Gedolim, of the great men of the time going to the Beit HaMikdash to want to pray. And he says, they pray in their houses. He quotes the Gemara. That it must be in the Beit HaMikdash, they would pray with a minyan, with 10 people. That's why everyone wanted to go. Or maybe they weren't literally in the temple, but they were in a shul on Har HaBayis. And he references a Gemara in Yuma and a Rashi there that seems to indicate that there was a shul in the Har HaBayis. And just quickly to see that inside, and just to clarify, I don't know if this was clear, so everyone feel free if you're pressured for time to leave. But I think we've officially extended this year to 8:30. You can slow things down a little bit and still, make it in time, see all the sources together. But feel free to leave if you have to. It'd be a shame if you miss the practice we're gonna do together. But for now, we're gonna keep going. Yeah, Paul, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I just want to. I mean, I do need to leave to get to another class, but two things that occur to me from what you're saying. Is a very important social function that Tefillah has. In terms of helping me gather with people. I mean, even during this whole Corona experience, I have found it actually quite gratifying to daven individually. Never before have I read Korbanot as thoroughly as I've read it, those Shabbatot that we did not have minyanim. And it was a delight to be able to do it, but Tefillah also took like 3-4 hours. Not everybody would be up for that kind of thing, but it has a function, a very important function, it seems. By way of not only connecting to God, but connecting to community, connecting to self. And I want to make a bit of a pitch. We have 15, 16 people on this call. On Friday, there's going to be a Zoom Kabbalat Shabbat. We've been doing it with 2, 3, 4 people. It would be wonderful to have more folks participating. It will be Rabbi Stahler's initial, he will be as his first leading the Kabbalat, the Zoom Kabbalat Shabbat. So I want to really invite everybody to join us and consider that. But I want to just go back, and we can talk later, Rabbi, about this social function that it sounds like Minyan performs.
So it's, I mean, it's unfortunate that you have to leave. I'm sorry to hear it, but you're not going to miss so much because you're stealing the shear here. You're getting to the conclusion that we're going to get to. So we're definitely going to mention the social function. I think it's a beautiful point, and it's going to be the heart of what we're building towards. So thank you for bringing it up, and I hope we can get them before you have to leave, but no pressure if you have to bow.
My apologies for having to go. Take care.
Yeah, for sure, absolutely not. But yeah, so poverty is a really important issue that we'll get to. But so what we see so far, and so what we see so far is this idea that Ali Tamar quotes the Gemara and says, clearly there was Minyan in the Temple Mount. Either as Minyan on the temple itself, or Minyan in the shul in the temple. We don't have to see it inside because it's not such an important point. But the Gemara in Yuma is discussing the Avodat Yom Kippurim, the temple service on Yom Kippur. And if you read the service that I sent out this year, we all know that part of the Yom Kippur service was that the Kohen Gadol would read from the Torah. He would read the section of the Torah that deals with Yom Kippur. And the Gemara describes that process. The Mishnah really describes that process of reading from the Torah. And in describing the process, it talks about Sicha, who got the Torah, and it says Chazan HaKnesset, not to Sefer Torah, not the Rosh HaKnesset. The Chazan, the prayer of the Knesset, took out the Torah and gave it to the head of the Knesset. Rosh HaKnesset, not know the Skan, not know the Kohen Gadol, etc., the chain of transmission, who passed the Torah, each dignitary. But there, comments Rashi, what's this idea of a Chazan Beit Knesset and a Rosh Beit Knesset? What's this Beit Knesset? Beit Knesset Hayasamach Lazar B'Har Bayit. There must have been a shul in Har Bayit. That's Rashi. So it says Ali Tamar, we see there was a shul on Har Bayit. We see that people were going to daven in Har Bayit. It must be there's a minyan in Har Bayit. And that's the direction that many people take. So just to review what we have so far before we pull it all together and conclude. We have a machloket whether it's a mitzvah to daven with a minyan. Maharil is skeptical and seems to say no. Magen Avram, Korban Tano seem to say yes. We pointed out that this question of whether or not it's a mitzvah will express itself halachically and how much weight you give minyan. Are you willing to prioritize minyan over other things, such as nusach, the text of davening, or over other mitzvot, like davening in a sukkah, etc.? So that's a clear expression of this question of is it a minyan? Is minyan a mitzvah? When we pointed out that the question of whether or not minyan is a mitzvah is itself question begging as to the purpose of minyan. And we said one model of minyan is that minyan is a function of prayer. Minyan is just about enhancing your prayer, and we offered various interpretations or inspirational perspectives of how it could enhance your prayer. But at the end of the day, minyan is just to enhance your prayer. And theoretically, if one could achieve the perfect prayer or have a more inspired prayer without minyan, that would be an equally legitimate option. But now what we're describing is a totally different approach. Minyan is a mitzvah, minyan is a requirement, and it's a well-founded one. It goes all the way back to the temple. But not only is it a well-founded one, it's one that in the times of the temple was extremely contained. Only the temple had minyan. Only the Temple Mount had minyan. And then it was only after the destruction of the temple that minyan spread and started to pop up everywhere. That's the alternative theory that we just described, we just explored through the Yerushalmi. And I want to ask an obvious question. What's going on with that? What are we saying? Why was there minyan only in the temple? I would have thought there's two options. Minyan has always existed. It goes back to the times of the Bible. God told Moses in Har Sinai, have a minyan. Or minyan was invented by the rabbis, and it came up during the rabbinic period post-temple, and much just like the text of our prayer is a response to the destruction of the temple, the institution of minyan is a response to the destruction of the temple. But what is this middle ground? What is this idea? Minyan is sort of a mitzvah, but not fully a mitzvah, but it's more of a mitzvah than other things because minyan always existed. Minyan went back to the temple, but only in the temple. So to that end, I want to suggest an explanation. Why would it be that in the times of the temple, minyan was in the temple only, and in the future, minyan is everywhere? So I think it's important to focus on the difference between society and Jewish practice with a temple and without one. In the times of the Beit HaMikdash, the temple, the Beit HaMikdash, was the focal point of religious practice, the focal point of spirituality. As such, when we said that there's a need, there's a mitzvah, there's this preconceived notion that predates even the rabbis, then there must be a minyan on the Temple Mount. There must be a quorum, a congregation that convenes on the Temple Mount. We're not serving a functional purpose. I who live in Tel Aviv, I who live in America, I who live in Australia, my prayer is not any better because 10 Jewish men in Israel are in the temple now. But rather what we're doing is a symbolic service, much like all of the service that takes place in the temple. It's not functional. It's not fulfilling a practical need, but the temple is a very showy symbolic procession. So when we convene a minyan in the temple, yeah, please.
Excuse me, may I ask you, during the temple times, how many men would make up the minyan? How many people? I mean, would it be similar to our going to synagogue? I mean, would all these people be Orthodox Jews, so to speak? Or, what was the nature of the minyan that was being held then?
Yeah, that's a great question. And as we saw, there's such little and ambiguous sourcing about whether this minyan in the temple even existed. There's no sources that directly discuss if there would be any differences of the minyan. But we did see very clearly, it's here the Ale Tamar, when he discusses it, he assumes it looks exactly like our minyan. Because he says, sorry, going up a little more, he says, mitpalim ba'asara, they'd pray with 10. Much like our minyan, and that's also just the formulation that the rabbinic literature often uses to refer to minyan. Mitpalim Basara, B'tzibor, the idea of 10. So I think it's a good point. That even if we want to say there was a minyan in the temple, that minyan could be sui generis. Maybe it looked different from the quorum that we're used to. I think that's a very powerful idea. And it just goes to contribute to this question we're trying to describe. What is going on with this unique historical temple minyan? Why did the Mikdash need a minyan? So I think if we take for granted this idea that the temple was the spiritual center of religious life, that Jewish life revolved around the temple in the times of the temple, what we have here is minyan not serving a functional role, but rather serving a symbolic role as part of the temple service. Just like we have to burn the ketoret and light the menorah and put the showbread out on the table, we also have to convene a minyan. And that's part of temple service. That's part of what takes place in the temple. Because at its core, and this is like what Richard was saying before, and what Paul concluded on before he left, minyan is a communal social action. And by making sure to make this symbolic action of convening a minyan on the Temple Mount, we're showing and demonstrating that our social lives, our interpersonal lives, our communal responsibilities are built around the temple. They're built around the focal point of our religious energies and our religious concentration. That we're merging the temple and its world of sacrifice and ritual with prayer and community and the world of interpersonal growth. And we're saying that the way we want to identify our community is a community that at its heart is a temple. And that's why in the times of the temple, we have this symbolic need for a minyan. It was not like the Mabit. It was not because it made prayer better. In fact, it didn't affect anybody except the few great men who lived in the temple, who lived close to the Temple Mount and could go up and make the minyan. But the symbolism of it, the idea of making that minyan, that was a powerful statement. That when a Jew builds a community, when we build our ideal community, we build it around the Mikdash, around the temple, just like the Jews in the desert. They built the Mishkan, they built the tabernacle at the center of their encampment and literally lived around it. So too, the temple, our religious focal point, that should be the center of our society. Once the temple was destroyed, though, there was no central point. There was no national center to focus our religious energies. But instead, what we're left with is not a Beit HaMikdash, but rather our multiple Mikdashei Ma'at, our mini temples. And we know throughout tradition and throughout halacha, the shul, the synagogue, is expressed as a mikdash ma'at, as a miniature and more temporary version of a temple. And thus, as Russell, yeah, please.
Since the tribes of Israel were throughout Israel and also on the other side of the Yarden, what was their responsibility in terms of their spiritual communications? Did they have a minyan?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. That according to this approach, that minyan was only in the temple. Then a lot of people who like you said, like Reuben, Gad, and Chatzi Menashe, who lived on the other side of the Jordan, people who lived all throughout Israel, they wouldn't get the opportunity to partake in the minyan. It would seem that only people who happened to be in Jerusalem in the temple area would do it. Which really, it just goes to emphasize. It's just like, if somebody lived in Beersheba or if somebody wasn't a Kohen, they would never sacrifice in the temple. They would never partake in the temple service. But nonetheless, the service was done for them. It was a symbolic process that was done on behalf of everybody. So I think we would say something similar about this minyan. If you lived over in Ever HaYarden, you're never going to be a part of a minyan in your life. You'll probably never be in the Temple Mount when they can be minyan. Maybe during the regalim, during the holidays, when you have a responsibility to visit the temple. Because we know that the temple was a backbone of religious practice. Everybody had to visit it 3 times a year, et cetera, et cetera. But maybe then. But in general, you would partake in this minyan. But the fact that it's still convened, its very existence, nonetheless made a statement. So that's the theory I want to put forth. But if that's the case, then once the temple was destroyed, and as Rav Soloveitchik once wrote, the kedusha of the temple, the holiness of the Temple Mount, became imperialistic. It spread throughout the world. There was no focal point anymore. That meant it was diluted. There was, as we saw before, the Mabit wrote, there was no one place where the Shekhinah was niglate, where God's presence was revealed. But it was also more accessible. And we have now a Mikdash Ma'at. We have our mini temples in our communities. And we know through multiple times in Gemara, multiple times in Sechet Megillah, we have this idea that the shul, our little sanctuaries, are a Mikdash Ma'at, are considered halachically miniature temples. And we learn various halachot from that. For example, just like there's an idea of hektish, an idea of holy goods that are owned by the temple that we're not allowed to use for personal use, the Mishnah Megillah tells us if you use the oil of the shul to burn in your own house, you've just committed me'ilah. You've just stolen from hektish, stolen from the holy goods. And there's a whole list of other responsibilities. Just like there's the idea of kavod and yiras hamikdash, fear and respect for the temple. There's an idea of kavod and yira for a mikdash ma'at, for a shul. You have to act and dress and speak in appropriate ways in a shul, etc., etc. Because our shul, our synagogues, delocalized, scattered throughout the world, miniature temples. And if that's the case, of course minyan becomes a thriving part of Jewish life, becomes a backbone of the Jewish experience only after the temple is destroyed. Because when we no longer have one unified community with a far-off temple at the center that serves as our symbolic heart and core of our religion, rather we're forced to build our own religious communities, our own practice and our own meaning, then that moment of minyan, that statement that we're going to build our community around the shul, that we're going to go and wed our social life to our religious life, that becomes all the more important. So while it might not be a full-blown mitzvah, it has significant halachic weight. This is a symbol and a statement, just like prayer, the words we say, the oral commitment of text, of liturgy, is a reincarnation, a re-expression of the avoda of the mikdash, of the temple service that took place every day, that now gets translated to the personal. So too the symbolic of minyan, of communal prayer that took place in the temple, gets translated into the mikdash ma'at, into the homes of every one of us. And thus, by building a shul and establishing a minyan, what we're doing is making a powerful statement that our communities, our religious communities, are built around the shul, are built around religious life. And our social commitments are imbued with religious meaning. That by having a shul, by having a religious community, even our congregating, our getting together as a group of friends, as a group of peers, that is imbued with spiritual meaning. And thus we have this position that it's not just something to be taken lightly, but it's really a mitzvah. It's really some form of requirement. But it's not a requirement on the individual, it's a requirement on the community. What about Hatziborhu, like we saw before? That every community should be making this statement and expressing that what they consider valuable, that the way they organize their community is by organizing around this idea of a minyan, this idea of a temple. And I think this is really expressed multiple places in the thought of Rav Soloveitchik. Because Rav Soloveitchik multiple times talks about the idea that Judaism seeks not just community as an answer to existential loneliness, but it seeks covenantal community. Man is created alone, the individual is born alone, we live in our own heads, which is a solely individual experience. But religion and shared commitment to religion gives us the opportunity to create covenantal community, a community that builds on its spiritual commitments together. Rav Soloveitchik famously writes in The Community, in his article and tradition describing Jewish community, when the I becomes aware of his being responsible for the well-being of the that whom he has helped bring into existence, a new community emerges, the community of prayer. What does this mean? It means a community of common pain, of common suffering. The halacha has taught the individual to include his fellow man in his prayer. The individual must not limit himself to his own needs, no matter how pressing those needs are and how distinct he is. In other words, an important part of prayer is the communal element, because the communal element breaks down the walls of the I, the individual experience, and creates a religious community that is bound together. Rav Reuven Ziegler, in his commentary on Rav Soloveitchik, later this got published as a book called Majesty and Humility, but I'm quoting from the VBM, the Virtual Beit Midrash. He goes further in depth and really fleshes out this opinion of the Rav. The covenantal faith community, what we're all striving to build in our shuls, in our Jewish homes, centers around shared commitments, not merely shared. Its members work together to cleanse, redeem, and hallow their existences. The I and the thou connect to each other by means of their mutual connection to the divine He. This connection to God takes the form of an absolute commitment, encompassing the totality of man's being, emotion, intellect, will, and action. When two different people share this absolute and all-encompassing commitment to God, it allows them to overcome the barriers separating them from one another. Opening himself totally to God, man can open himself to other people as well, with shared values and goals serving as a basis for communication. Mutual commitment thus becomes the foundation of the existential community. The overcoming of barriers which separate individuals takes place, as I termed it when discussing the community, along both horizontal and vertical axes. This is a little technical, but here comes another money quote. Members of a covenantal community join their contemporaries through sympathy, love, and common action. They express concern for each other's welfare via, for example, prayer and charity. So it says thereof, what is the role of prayer? What is the role of minyan, of communal prayer? It is that moment where we're able to come together and express that as a community, we have shared interest and we get together to talk about sports and TV and movie and music and culture, but we also are more than shared interest. We're also shared commitments that we have to come together to build something, to build a minyan, to build a communal religious experience, because that's what the human world is about. It's about building community, building civilization. And we shouldn't relegate that to the world of secular, not to diminish secular, but secular culture, the world of mechanical and technological innovation. Building civilization also means building spiritual civilization, building a religiously imbued social network and social community, building what he terms the covenantal faith community or the covenantal prayer community. So says the Rav, what is the purpose of minyan? What is the mitzvah? And why does it carry so much weight? Because it lies at the heart of our goal as Jews in the world, trying to build civilization, build our own communities. Minyan is the statement that community and religiosity go hand in hand, that they complement each other and are inseparable from each other. So just to review, we had this question of minyan. Is minyan a mitzvah or not? What is the status of minyan? We pointed out that it seems between the Maharil and others, it's machloket if it's a mitzvah or not. And if you think it's not a mitzvah, then you really think it's not a mitzvah. You would even say it's not prioritized halachically. We said, what's the point of minyan if it's not a mitzvah? And we offered a functional explanation of the Mabit. The Mabit says it enhances your prayer. It makes you pray better. On the other hand, we saw that Rav Avadia and others said, no, it is, but it's not merely functional. And we asked, what is the role of minyan if it's not merely functional? And we said it's a symbolic ritual that predates even the rabbis, goes all the way back to the temple. And it's about how we lay out our communities, how we establish our communal focal points. Just like in the temple, and the social world is built around minyan and built around communal prayer, caring for each other, and charity for each other. So too nowadays, we must build a show where we have communal prayer, where we have the opportunity to congregate and to pray for each other. And now to transition into what I want to try and practice every week, this prayer practice based on Rav Zenger, in Hebrew it's Rav Zenger, in English it's Rav Singer, Rav Dov Zenger's book, Tikon Tefillati, Prepare My Prayer. I want to focus on this idea of the Rav, that part of a community, part of getting together to be a prayer community, a covenantal community, is that when we pray together, I'm given the opportunity to pray for you. I'm given the opportunity to pray with you, to involve myself in your life, your spiritual life, your physical life, and to really join together. So to that end, I want to read a passage from Rav Zenger, a poem he writes. Every chapter of Rav Zenger's book is a section of traditional sources, followed by a poem he writes, and then a hands-on activity that he recommends. So to read the poem that Rav Zenger writes, translated into English. In community prayer, in a chabura of worshipers, we come together to God. We step out of our isolation, our separation, and connect. We move from 10 individuals to a minyan, a quorum of prayer, from 20 legs standing next to another to 10 hearts beating together. In our prayer for one another, we raise the level of love that exists among us, the responsibility and the connection. The one between us is what allows us to open our hearts and pray for one another. It's the poem that Rav Zenger writes. And now for the activity. We're going to start with perhaps an easier activity. Some of these get a little personal, a little difficult, but I really look forward to doing all those together. The activity for this week that Rav Zenger recommends is so powerful and so beautiful. Rav Zenger recommends that, and we'll do this, we'll lay it out as this. Give everybody a minute or two to think, everybody in the chat, and then I'd request as much participation as possible that everybody message me one thing that they pray for, one thing they care about for. You can leave it as ambiguous and anonymous as you want it, or you can be highly specific if you feel comfortable. And then everyone will receive as an assignment somebody else's prayer commitment. And the exercise is at one point during this week, while you're praying for yourself, while you're davening, pray for somebody else in your community too. And the hope is that one, hearing other people's prayers will normalize prayer, will make it familiar, perhaps inspire you and make you think about things you never even thought to pray about. But two, it'll really solidify this idea that we don't pray as individuals. We pray as a community. I'm praying for you too, not just next to you. So if everyone want to take a minute or two, think about something they want to, and then to privately message me, and then I'll just go and I'll message everybody else, someone else's, and then together we can all try this week when we pray, and we can all report back how it went next week. So I'll give everybody a minute or two. I'll think of mine also. See, one person already messaged me theirs. Everyone feel free. Jeff has book too.
You had mentioned it at some point, so I bought it. It's available on Amazon.
It's awesome. I hope you enjoy it.
I am enjoying it. And now I'll enjoy it even more.
Can you type the name into the chat, one of you?
Sure.
All right, 30 more seconds to get it in. Then I'll go and assign to other people. Sadly, I'll only assign you one if you are also one who participated, because otherwise the numbers don't work out. But I definitely encourage everyone to participate. Give us 30 more seconds. All right, so now I'll start sending out other people's prayers. Oh, no, I'm still getting some. So I'll give people more time. It's honestly, it's hard to think of one thing you want to pray for the most. It took me a while to think about it myself as well. All right, and now I'll start messaging people back with people's prayers. Copy and paste them. All right. Okay. And then that. And then I think I only have 2 more. Actually, I think I might. Oh no, there's one more. I'm going to send that to George, and George, you accidentally sent it to everybody. But George, I'm going to pray for your prayer this week. And then I think, did everybody receive? Oh no, one person did not. And then there we go. Did anyone message me with one and did not receive one? one back? If so, please just message in the group. But otherwise, I think everyone who messaged me got somebody else's prayer back. So feel free to sit with these, to think about them, to think selfishly. How does this relate to me? Is this something I would pray for? Have I ever thought of that? Should I think about that? And then to think about the other, to take the opportunity during this week to pray for someone in our community, to reflect on what that means, that we're able to pray for each other, and maybe even to take this as the first step of being able to really open up about seeking support from each other. And then hopefully we can succeed in striving for this goal of Minyan, of a covenantal community, of a supportive community, of a community where we're all there together, wedding our social lives with our religious lives and really building something together. So thank you all for coming this year. We'll meet again, same time, same place next week. And have a good Shabbos, everybody.